August 14th, 1944. Manzanar War Relocation Center, California. The silence of the high desert was a liar. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the gritty rasp of wind against barrack paper and the low, constant hum of flies buzzing over the latrines. Hannah pressed her younger sister, Emmy, tighter against her side, the girl's small shoulders trembling beneath her thin cotton dress. A corporal, his face young and sunburned beneath his helmet, stood by the mess hall entrance. He wasn't looking at them, his gaze fixed on the crude, hand-painted sign posted on the door. Loyalty must be proven. Cooperation is mandatory. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but his hands were empty. Every evening, he performed the same small ritual, a slight, almost imperceptible nod as the families filed past, a gesture of no harm. Hannah felt the sharp edge of the empty metal tin in her pocket, its unfamiliar weight a cold reminder. She nudged Emmy forward. "It's okay," she whispered, the words almost stolen by the wind. "We just eat." We hope these glimpses into history resonate with you. Subscribe to explore more stories from around the world, and feel free to share which country's untold histories you'd like to see next. 18 months earlier, San Francisco, California. The house was quiet, filled with the soft, late-afternoon light of a California suburb in 1988. It was a silence Hannah had worked her whole life to build, a peace measured in trimmed lawns and the gentle hum of a refrigerator. In the center of her polished dining table sat a small, ugly thing of rust and memory, an old Spam tin. For over 40 years, it had remained hidden. Now, it was her only planned testimony. Her son, Kenji, stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. He had his father's posture, but his eyes held a modern impatience. "You don't have to do this, Mom," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's over. Let it be over. This is just reopening a wound for money." Hannah ran a finger over the tin's corroded edge, feeling the grit. She looked at her son, a man who had only known this quiet house, this curated peace. He saw the redress check as a government handout, a final humiliation. He did not see the weight of the silence it was meant to acknowledge. "The money is not the point, Kenji," she said softly. "The point is that the story is told correctly. By us." He sighed, unable to bridge the chasm between them. They won't understand. Perhaps he was right. How could she explain the taste of dust, the shame that had no name? Instead of arguing, she retrieved a square of silk from a wooden box, a remnant of a kimono her mother had been forced to leave behind. Carefully, she wrapped the rusty Spam tin, the smooth fabric a stark contrast to the decaying metal. The object, once a symbol of her dehumanization, became something sacred in its silk shroud. She placed the small bundle into her handbag, its weight a familiar anchor in the pit of her stomach. She had carried it in secret for years. Now she would carry it into the light. She walked past her son, pausing only to place a hand on his arm. Then she left for the hearing, leaving the silence of the house behind her. The air outside their Geary Street home still smelled of salt from the bay, but it was tainted now with the unfamiliar acrid scent of diesel. April 1942. The world had shrunk to the size of the single suitcase each of them was allowed to carry. Soldiers, their faces impassive and young, stood on the sidewalk as neighbors watched from behind curtains, their silence a mixture of pity and fear. Hannah clutched her younger sister Emmy's hand, the small fingers cold in her own. "Just the essentials," a corporal had barked, pointing to their pile of belongings on the floor. "One bag each. Let's go." Her mother was kneeling before an open trunk, her hands hovering between a stack of silk kimonos and her wedding china. She chose neither. Beside her, Hannah's father stood over the family photo album, its leather cover worn smooth by years of touch. He looked at it, then at the 2 woolen blankets beside it. His face, a mask of forced calm, tightened for a fraction of a second. He picked up the blankets and stuffed them into a suitcase. The album was left behind. A hot, useless anger surged in Hannah's chest. Every birthday, every New Year, every small moment that proved they existed was in that book. To leave it was to leave their history on the floor for strangers to discard. She wanted to scream, to protest that they were not criminals, that this was their home. But she caught Emmy's wide, terrified eyes and swallowed the rage. She forced her face into a placid mask, mirroring her father's own. Strength, she realized, was just another performance. A government official pinned a paper tag to her coat. Family number 3453. It was her new name. As they were herded onto the bus, she took one last look at their front door, the paint peeling slightly near the handle. Then the doors hissed shut, and the smell of diesel was all that was left. The mess hall at Manzanar was not a room. It was a cavern of noise. Hundreds of strangers, their faces drawn and tired, sat at long wooden tables. The air, thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and disinfectant, clung to the back of Hannah's throat. This was where the private, sacred ritual of a family meal was meant to happen. There were no tablecloths, no familiar ceramic bowls, only the loud clatter of metal trays on wood. They moved through the line, shuffling past steaming vats. A woman with a weary face slopped stewed tomatoes onto Hannah's tray, followed by a scoop of rice. Then came a thick slice of pink gelatinous meat slid from a rectangular blue tin. She had never seen anything like it. The label read Spam. At the table, her father said a quiet Buddhist grace, his voice nearly lost in the din. It was an act of defiance, a claim to a space that was not their own, but the food remained alien. Emmy stared at the pink slab on her tray, her lower lip trembling. "I don't want it," she whispered, pushing the tray away. Her mother urged her gently, but Emmy shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. The humiliation was a physical thing, a tightening in Hannah's stomach. It wasn't just the strange food, it was the public nature of their struggle. For a moment, Hannah felt the same useless anger from the bus. Then she looked at the slice of meat. Taking her fork, she carefully carved at the edges, cutting away small pieces until the blocky shape resembled a clumsy five-petaled flower. She pushed the tray back toward her sister. "It's a flower," she said simply. Emmy looked, her curiosity overriding her disgust. Hesitantly, she picked up her own fork and took a small bite. As they ate, Hannah saw an empty Spam tin tossed into a nearby bin. On an impulse she couldn't explain, she retrieved it, wiping it clean with her napkin before slipping it into her pocket. The sharp metal edge was cold against her leg, a hard piece of proof from their very first supper. The dust was a constant companion. It coated their tongues, settled in the lines of their hands, and turned the vibrant California sun into a hazy, indifferent glare. Days bled into a monotonous rhythm of roll calls and mess hall lines. Despair was a quiet, creeping thing. One afternoon, Hannah watched her father standing before the small patch of barren earth beside their barrack door. He stared at the cracked, pale ground as if he could will life into it. In San Francisco, he had been a man who coaxed magic from the soil. His chrysanthemums were the pride of the neighborhood. Here, there was only dust and scrub brush. He had asked the administration for tools, a spade, a hoe, anything. The request was denied. Non-essential, the form letter stated. For 2 days, he just stood there, studying the ground. On the third day, he returned from the mess hall with a spoon concealed in his pocket. He knelt, his back straight, and began to dig. The sound was pathetic at first, a weak, metallic scratching against the compacted earth. Each spoonful of dirt he dislodged was a tiny, hard-won victory. He worked without speaking, his movements patient and deliberate. It was not an act of anger, but of profound intention. Hannah watched from the doorway, the empty Spam tin sitting on the small shelf beside her cot. She saw the futility of his task, a spoon against the desert. But she also saw the purpose in his posture, a quiet refusal to be broken. He was not just digging a hole, he was carving out a space for them to live, not just exist. She went back to the mess hall, secured a spoon of her own, and returned to kneel beside him. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. There was only the rhythmic scrape of metal on dirt, a shared, silent promise that they would make something grow here, even if it was only hope. In February of 1943, the government distributed a form that was more potent than any guard tower or barbed wire fence. It was an official document, application for leave clearance, but everyone called it the loyalty questionnaire. 2 questions, numbers 27 and 28, became the axis on which their world now tilted. Question 27 asked if they were willing to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. Question 28 asked if they would forswear all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. To answer yes, yes was to prove loyalty. To answer no, no was to confirm suspicion. The barracks buzzed with hushed, frantic arguments. Neighbors became strangers, their faces tight with fear and mistrust. Answering yes to 27 felt like offering up their sons to the same army that imprisoned them. Answering yes to 28 felt like renouncing a heritage they were being punished for having in the first place. It was a perfect trap. That night, their small room felt suffocating. Hannah's father held the form in his hands, his knuckles white. If I say yes, I am not a loyal American. I am a liar renouncing a country I have never known. If I say no, I am a disloyal American, he said, his voice a low rasp. There is no right answer. Hannah looked at the Spam tin on the shelf. It was a piece of America they had been forced to swallow. And now this paper was asking them to swallow their identity too. Her mother, who had been mending a tear in Emmy's dress, set down her sewing kit. Her movements were calm and precise. "We will not lie," she said, her voice clear and steady in the small room. It cut through the fear. "We are who we are. We will answer from our hearts, and whatever happens, we will face it as a family." Her father looked at her, and a flicker of his old strength returned to his eyes. He picked up a pen. The decision was made, not out of political calculation, but out of a simple, profound need to keep their family whole. The infirmary smelled of rubbing alcohol and quiet fear. Emmy lay on a narrow cot, her small body lost in the stiff, white sheets. Her breaths were shallow, each one a tiny struggle against the dust that had settled deep in her lungs. The doctor, a harried man with tired eyes, had diagnosed it as pneumonia, a common ailment in the camp where the fine desert sand invaded everything. He gave them cough syrup, but it did little to stop the relentless, weak hacking. Hannah sat by her sister's side for hours, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. She watched the life drain from Emmy's face, her once bright eyes now dull and clouded. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in her chest. She had promised to protect her. She had carved the Spam into a flower, but she could not carve the sickness out of her sister's body. One afternoon, a young nurse named Sarah, a white woman from a nearby town, checked on Emmy. She had kind eyes and a gentle touch. Seeing the despair on Hannah's face, Sarah glanced around the ward, then pressed something small and firm into Hannah's hand. "Don't let anyone see," she whispered. "The vitamin C will be good for her." Hannah opened her palm. Lying there was a small orange, its skin a burst of impossible color against the drabness of the infirmary. Fresh fruit was a luxury, a piece of the outside world they were no longer allowed. It was contraband. Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental, an act of shared humanity that defied the rules of the camp. She peeled it carefully, the sharp, sweet scent filling the sterile air. She held a slice to Emmy's lips. Her sister, who had refused food for a day, slowly opened her mouth and took it. A faint smile touched her cracked lips. For a moment, the orange was a sun, a promise of warmth and life. But as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the barrack, Emmy's fever began to climb again. The orange was not enough. 2 nights later, in the suffocating quiet of the barrack, Emmy's struggle ended. Her final breath was a sigh so small Hannah almost missed it. Silence rushed in to fill the space, vast and cold and absolute. There was no dignity in it. A doctor signed a form. Attendants came with a canvas stretcher. Her mother's wail was a raw, tearing sound that the thin wooden walls could not contain. They were allowed a small, perfunctory service at the camp's makeshift cemetery, a patch of windswept land where the dust never settled. The family stood together, strangers in their own grief, while a Buddhist priest chanted sutras that were snatched away by the wind. It was over in minutes. Back in the barrack, the emptiness was a physical presence. Emmy's cot was a void. Her few belongings, a cloth doll, a small collection of smooth stones, felt like relics from another life. Hannah's guilt was a sharp, unrelenting pain. She had failed. The flower, the orange, none of it had been enough. She found the shriveled, browning peel of the orange on the small table. The sweet scent was gone, leaving only a faint, bittersweet memory. On impulse, she picked it up. Her eyes fell on the Spam tin sitting on the shelf. It was empty, clean, a hollow metal box. With careful, deliberate movements, she placed the piece of orange peel inside. Then she took a small, smooth stone from Emmy's collection and laid it next to the peel. It wasn't a funeral. It was something more private, more permanent. It was a promise. She put the lid back on. The tin was no longer a piece of trash. It was a shrine, a secret place to hold the weight of their loss. In August of 1945, a wave of rumors washed over the camp, followed by the official announcement: the war was over. The gates would open. They were free to go. But the word free felt hollow, a strange and ill-fitting garment. Freedom meant leaving the barbed wire, but it also meant stepping into a world that had erased them. Their home in San Francisco had been sold, their possessions liquidated. They had nothing to return to. The administration offered each person $25 and a one-way train ticket. The message was clear: you are no longer our problem. A palpable anxiety replaced the dull resignation of camp life. Where would they go? What would they do? Hannah packed their few belongings into a single suitcase, the same one they had arrived with, though it now seemed heavier with all that it had seen. She folded her father's worn shirt, her mother's mending kit. Then she picked up the Spam tin. It was cool and solid in her hands. She carefully wrapped it in a piece of spare cloth and placed it gently among the clothes. Her father, watching from the doorway, saw the small, careful motion. His face was a mask of exhaustion, aged a decade and 3 years. He didn't ask what was inside or why she was keeping a piece of trash. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a deep, weary understanding. "Some things we must carry," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "so that we do not forget." It was an absolution. In his words, the tin was no longer just her secret shrine. It was their shared history, the weight of Emmy's absence, the taste of their humiliation, the proof of their survival. On the day they left Manzanar, walking away from the barracks in the dust for the last time, Hannah carried the suitcase. She could feel the slight, hard weight of the tin inside, a cold reminder of a debt that had not yet been paid. The years that followed were a study in determined silence. Hana married a quiet man, another Nisei who understood the unspoken rules of their new lives. They raised a son, Kenji, in a small suburban house with a neat lawn and a cherry tree in the backyard. She worked hard, spoke perfect English, and never mentioned the dust, the barbed wire, or the numbered tag. Manzanar became a locked room in her mind, a place she never visited. The spam tin was tucked away in the back of a closet, wrapped in silk, its existence a secret she kept even from herself most days. But the silence had a weight. Kenji grew up with a curiosity his parents could not satisfy. He was a child of the 60s, shaped by questions of justice and identity. He read books, joined student groups, and came home from college with a fire in his eyes. He asked about the camps, a word Hana flinched from, and she would change the subject. He asked why they had never gone back to San Francisco, and his father would simply shake his head. The confrontation happened one Thanksgiving. Kenji, home for the holiday, was helping her in the kitchen. "I read about the Redress movement," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "People are starting to talk, to testify." "There's nothing to talk about," Hana said, her knuckles white as she gripped a potato peeler. "Nothing to talk about?" His voice rose. "You were imprisoned. Your family lost everything. Emmy—" "Do not say her name," Hana whispered, a tremor in her voice. "Why?" Kenji's frustration finally broke through. "Because you're ashamed? Ashamed of what they did to us?" The accusation struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked at her son, this bright, passionate American boy, and saw a chasm between them, carved out by the silence she had mistaken for protection. He saw shame where she had intended to build a shield. The weight of all the unspoken years pressed down on her, and for the first time, she felt the foundations of her quiet life begin to crack. The hearing room was quiet, formal, and intimidating. The air hummed with the weight of unspoken histories. Hana sat at a long table, a microphone before her, a pitcher of water to her right. In the audience, she could see Kenji. His face was tense, but his eyes held a new understanding, a quiet encouragement she had not seen before. He had driven her here this morning, and in the car he had simply said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." It was all she needed. When her name was called, a kind-faced woman on the panel asked her to share her experience. The room waited. All those years of silence pressed in on her, threatening to keep her voice locked away. But then she thought of Emmy, of her father's quiet dignity, of her mother's resilience. Slowly, deliberately, Hana reached into the silk cloth in her lap. She unwrapped it with the care of a priest handling a sacred relic. She placed the rusty, dented spam tin on the polished table just before the microphone. A soft clink echoed in the silent room. The object sat there, a wound on the smooth wood, ugly and out of place. It was a piece of garbage. It was a shrine. It was evidence. "My testimony is this," Hana began, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. She did not need to raise it. The microphone did the work for her. She told them about the number on a tag, about the taste of their first meal in the dust. She spoke of a small, withered orange peel and a stone from a child's collection. She explained how this tin, a symbol of their daily indignity, had become the only place they could safely keep their grief. She spoke for Emmy. She spoke for her parents. And as she finished, she looked at Kenji. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. The silence was finally, truly broken. Months later, a letter arrived. It contained a formal apology from the United States government and a check. It wasn't about the money. It was the words, the official acknowledgement. It was the country finally saying, "We were wrong." Hana placed the letter next to the spam tin, its work at last complete.